Well, another thing that happened, as many of these so-called sell side, the large financial institutions, stopped being private partnerships and became public, is that people were playing with other people's money. So that the logic of options put your wisdom as a custodian, or a guardian of capital, at odds with your capacity to make money, because you could leverage up and the gains were yours and the losses were handed to someone else.
Very much so. And I think the change in incentive structures became absolutely paramount. And I think it's inbuilt into the system. And I think to some extent, I think the remuneration structures, the changes in that were really unfortunate. Because when I went into banking, and all through the 80s and early 90s even, banking was well paid. Don't let me say that everybody was poor, but it wasn't the egregious levels of salary that you now see. And I think you're right. The change from a private partnership, which was what most investment banks were, to a public listed company, actually helped drive that. And the golden sort of handshake of the partnership was replaced by these bonus systems. And let's be honest, you can never have a bonus system which is not going to get gamed to some extent. And particularly with complex products where you have valuation models, valuation techniques, which are at best educated approximations of what they're worth, and then people game the system. And I've worked with traders, I've worked with people who are extremely clever people, and they do understand how they're going to get paid. And at the end of the day, they basically will try to manipulate the system to their advantage. And to some extent, they're encouraged to do that. And all these arguments about, they're just evil people or whatever, it's not. It's innate. I mean, it's like rats running around in a maze. You touch the button, which gives you food, not the one that gives you an electric shock. And that's how they adapt. And that became hugely problematic in the crisis, as we know.
And what we saw in the years building up is that each top management had to imitate the others for fear of, departing too far from the norm. And if you lost a lot of money when others were making it, not because you blew up, but because others made a lot and you were neutral, you could lose your job. You could lose those big bonus pools for you and your team. So people were almost induced to come in and adopt the prevailing model that seemed to be churning out what you might call the tremendous flows of profit in the short term, even if you're someday going to hit the wall.
Look, I couldn't agree more, because one of the fundamental things is everybody likes to think they're an individual, but in business, as you know, deviating from the norm, the consensus, is extremely dangerous. As I've always said, you can be an outlier, in which case you either lose big or you win big. And no management team, no senior manager wants to expose him to that risk. It's a bit like an index fund. We might have 90% in the index, 10% as the outlying bet. And so everybody clustered around the same strategies, and to some extent our whole system of how management operates reinforces that. And so what happens under those circumstances, you either consciously or implicitly start to ape each other. And then that creates a different problem. Firstly, everybody's in the same boat, and you're absolutely correct. So if you lose money and everybody else is losing money, it's a relative performance game. So you say, I lost less money than the next guy. You don't ask the question, well, maybe I shouldn't have lost that money. But more importantly than that, you get clustering of risk, because everybody is no longer can you have diversified exposures. You have very concentrated exposures, crowded trades where everybody has the same trade on at the same time. And then what happens is when you get a shock to the system, it becomes unmanageable. The best way to think about it is you've got a lot of water in a small area and you drop a stone in it. And basically there's no dissipation of the waves. You get this just overrun over the edges of the bowl. And that's a huge problem. And what actually happened to some extent is the industry made a rod for its own back. Because effectively, as profit margins on client business got eroded away, there was only two ways of essentially compensating for the loss in revenue. One was volume. So you had to find new markets and churn more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And the
second, new products before they were imitated.
Exactly.
Higher margin.
And most of the products really were variations on existing products. I used to teach a course in which we used to go through structured products. And it was almost palpable, the disappointment in people when I said, actually, when you look at this, you strip out all the products, there's like 6 or 7. And they came with the expectation of this sort of menu of infinite choice. Yeah. I'm saying there is infinite choice, but it's variations on a theme rather than entirely new products. But the critical thing there was those products were very important to often, and this is the unfortunate part, misrepresent risk to people who really shouldn't have been taking those risks. But the second source of profit there was proprietary trading, because people started to take risks. So everybody now had incentives or skin in the game for churning, creating more and more complex product to create more and more flow for that churning, and also taking positions. But unfortunately, as you correctly point out, the client business never really changed because the underlying risks you're trading or hedging never really change, and that grows with GDP or activity around the world. It doesn't change because you want it to change. And so the churn became the way to maintain profitability because you build these massive infrastructures and you've got to have more flow through that infrastructure, economies of scale and scope cutting. So what happened was everybody got themselves into this mess because everybody did the same things. They were all interrelated. And more to the point, there was no real risk layoff. Because if you look at the derivative market, in an ideal world, it should be basically matching somebody with somebody else with offsetting exposures, except we forgot that. And we started to believe in our models of how we could spread this risk. And I remember saying to somebody who used to work for me, I said, just be very careful to understand that ultimately any risk you take on is just a repackaging of this risk, and we'll have to find a way to repackage it for somebody else, who'll have to find a way to repackage it for somewhere else. The risk doesn't disappear, it just circulates through the system.